of Software Management Practice at Carnegie Mellon Silicon Valley campus, and is also the Executive Director of its Center for Open Source Investigations. We have followed Tony many years. He's been involved in a long list of initiatives. So if there's somebody that has an opinion about open source business and understands this, it must be Tony. I'm daring to ask him to give a disruptive or provocative talk. I know that this can be a high-risk proposition, but I would love to hear it, so I hope you guys will join me for that. He's also a fellow of ACM and a life fellow of IEEE. Tony Wasserman.
Thanks, everybody. I'm pleased to be here. It's a beautiful area, and I've been in Sicily before, but never down here. But I want to start by telling you that the first house that I bought in San Francisco was on Malta. So let's see the first slide. And there's the street sign for the intersection on our street. So at least that's one of the ways that I learned about Malta, but it was not the first way that I learned about Malta. The first way that I learned about Malta, next slide, is from the movie, The Maltese Falcon, which certainly is well known to all of us film aficionados in the States. It's set in San Francisco. And in fact, if you come to San Francisco, you can take a Maltese Falcon tour, which is pretty good considering that the movie is now 70 years old. Now, that's not intended to be provocative, right? Oh, he's jumped ahead of me to the next slide already. One of the things about my slides, and one of the reason for this, is that this is an open source conference. So my presentation is running on Ubuntu Linux, the latest version. It's an open document format, using LibreOffice, and the fonts are open source. So I wasn't going to do a presentation about open source on a Windows machine. So, but I thank, you noticed they plugged it in, it came right up, it all works. One of the things that people are particularly interested in, and this follows up really on something that Jim Jagelski was talking about this morning, is the business opportunities around open source and the software that is licensed in such a way that makes it possible to do commercial business. Now, one of the triggering events for the growth of commercial open source was IBM's decision to include the Apache web server in WebSphere, a commercial product. And it was that activity that made IBM one of the first to include open source software in a commercial product. But as a little bit of history, Sun OS was the first taking BSD Unix, and I think I was the second. I had a system called Software Through Pictures, started a company, Interactive Development Environments, and we took some software we had built in the University of California that came with a BSD license, and we included some of that in our software, and so we shipped that as an open source, or as a commercial product in 1984. So these ideas around open source and open source business go back further than you might think. But the IBM WebSphere decision was very important for several reasons. First of all, because it validated the notion that you could have a business. Second of all, it was an endorsement by IBM of the quality of the open source product and the fact that they were willing to rely on a third party to provide and maintain that open source software. Now, of course, IBM has been a very good citizen around open source, and they have contributed many dollars and people and projects. Many developers use Eclipse. That came out of IBM as well. And IBM, for a long time, had more than 100 engineers working on Eclipse. So they have been a terrific supporter of the open source community. But now, following that and the creation of the Open Source Initiative also in 1998, we look around and say, well, if I wanted to use open source software in my business, if I wanted to use it in some business critical application, or if I wanted to start a business that grew out of open source software, where am I? Well, the first thing you'd notice is that the platform and infrastructure support is really strong, right? Web servers, operating systems, middleware of all sorts, mail programs, Java Enterprise Edition, all of these components of most infrastructures have very sizable open source solutions, ones that are very mature and solid that you can rely upon. If you look at what's going on in cloud computing and with the NoSQL databases, again, you'll see that the infrastructure support with open source products is very strong. And there's a big consortium of companies that's pushing OpenStack, which came out of a relationship between Rackspace, a commercial vendor, and the NASA, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration. So again, looking forward and looking at what's happening with cloud computing, we're seeing more and more uptake on mobile, or on open, and we're also seeing suppliers who are offering infrastructure as a service and platforms as a service, all again using open source components. So it makes it a very solid foundation. And one of the things that you'll see is that many of the startups that are offering software as a service to you are in fact building their applications on top of open source software. Well, that's terrific. Why is it? Because most of the cloud platform vendors offer free developer access to their cloud solutions. Second, the developers don't have to build that infrastructure again and again and again. They can use this proven infrastructure. And what that means is that the cost of getting a new application up and running is very tiny. When I started a company, we had to buy servers and we had to buy software. You know, it took us a while, it cost us some money. Today, you can be up and running with a hosted service and your domain name and a website in less than an hour. A couple of years ago, on December 31st, I had money to use. And I said, okay, let me, pay for hosting service and let me get up and running. And there I was, right, on the last day of the year with time to spare. So, there are all kinds of development and collaboration tools. In fact, the open source development tools have pretty much wiped out the commercial tools business. Not 100%, because there's things like, Visual Studio is still around for Microsoft. But for the large share of the market and all the companies that we might think of as vendors of development tools, they're history. And developers, of course, are brave souls. They try stuff out. It's easy for them to use these tools because they're not going into the final product. So there's fewer of the compliance issues and things like that. So people have started creating businesses around open source. And what happened about 6 or 7 years ago was that investors decided that there were, in fact, viable business models. And they saw companies building open source software and getting acquired and making interesting amounts of money. A couple of years ago, when MySQL was acquired by Sun Microsystems, the purchase price was $1 billion. So that's a fair amount of money. Now, that's not going to happen again anytime real soon, but still, it shows that it's a huge payoff for something that was open source software. Let's go to the next slide. So why are we seeing all these commercial opportunities? Well, one thing that's driven things in the past couple of years, in fact, has been the economic situation. IT managers are told that their budgets for software tools is now zero. Well, that doesn't stop you if you're creative. So they've in fact found that open source software meets the needs and in many cases is superior to what they were doing. It's also the fact that we have a large number of proven, solid open source tools for which there is commercial support. And a third area is user unhappiness with traditional licensing models. You have to pay a large amount of money and you have to pay a license fee, and then you're locked into that product because Oracle is not going to turn around and give you your money back. Whereas you have more freedom to change when your sunk investment is smaller. So let's go on. So I was in Seattle, and I saw this old boat called the Arthur Foss. And I thought that we should draw attention to that because it's obviously our ship in the open source community, right? But it's not going to be coming here for the Rolex race, but it's the Arthur Foss, right? Okay, let's go on. So, how do you make money at open source software when it's supposed to be free? Well, it is free, but we're going to talk about a dozen different ways that you can make money on open source software. And we'll talk about some of these fairly quickly in the interest of time. But the first thing that's really important is that there are a lot of companies that want to use open source software, but they don't understand the notion of free. They don't understand that they can simply download it, install it, and use it. They want to pay. Seriously. And they want to pay for support. They want to pay for customization. They want to pay for training. They want to pay for everything because they want to be able to call somebody up in the middle of the night and say, I have a problem. And in fact, many IT organizations have a rule that they cannot use any software for which they do not have a paid support contract. I kid you not. This is a true situation. So one of the first open source businesses was a company that existed to provide commercial support for the Apache web browser. Now this is a piece of software that doesn't break. It is about the most solid piece of software that you could ever hope to acquire. And it runs on every platform that you can imagine. Right, Jim? Yes. Okay. So doesn't this sound like a great business? I'm in the business of supporting the Apache web server. Send me a check every month, and I will let you know if there's a problem. Okay. So the company that did this went out of business for reasons that had nothing to do with Apache, but still. So we've also seen all these new companies come along to commercialize and build businesses on new and innovative ideas. In the early days of free and open source software, we saw that a lot of products were Me Too products. They were trying to match open standards and open interfaces. But what we see now in many cases are products that are really innovative. And when you start looking for best of class in a category, the open source products are at least the match and sometimes superior to the commercial equivalents, depending on your personal preferences. The other area that I want to talk about that's important is local support and training for open source. So I can be here in Malta and I can download some piece of open source software and it's in English. And I want to be able to support my local population, some of which speaks Maltese. Now, as good as the open source projects are at supporting lots of different languages, Maltese is not high on the list because the population that would be using it is relatively small. But guess what? Well-architected open source software means that all the text is in separate files, the translation is easily doable, and suddenly you have a Maltese version of Linux or MySQL or whatever set of menus you want to customize for a product. And then you can provide support for that. Let's go on. Next slide, please. So this is China Beach in San Francisco, which is outside the Golden Gate Bridge. Let's go ahead. So what are the ways that people are now selling their services and supporting their products. Well, the most common one is a subscription model. So Red Hat is a perfectly good example of that, where Red Hat Enterprise Linux is available on a subscription basis. You pay a certain amount of money per machine, and this means that you get support and that you get updates, and if there are security problems of one kind or another, you get notified about those very, very quickly. That's the most effective way, and most of the commercial software, open source software companies, the single vendor ones, offer a plan of that nature. Now, suppose I don't want to use that. If the software comes with an open source license, like Fedora or Ubuntu, I can download it. When I was running Ubuntu this morning, I had last week upgraded to the latest and greatest version of Ubuntu, which is 11.10. But when I signed on this morning, it told me that there were 44 updates. Now, since I'm a brave soul, I said, go for it. And so I can manually do this. But of course, I could also pay somebody to do it for me or to notify me, hey, Tony, you better update these things right now. So let's go on. Another possibility is that you have vendors who have commercial and open source products. So, for example, CollabNet, which is the source of the original source of the Subversion project, which now resides with the Apache Software Foundation, is a completely open source product. But CollabNet has also created an enhanced version of it, which they offer as a commercial product. Okay, and the Apache license makes that possible. And Sugar CRM started as an open source company. They build themselves as an open source company. We could have a long discussion about that. But there's a community edition of Sugar CRM that you can download. They also offer, for money, a hosted version as well as a pro version. And the pro version has code that's not included in the community edition, and in fact has a different user interface. But the core of it, what's in the community edition, is made open to everybody. So you'll find that there are vendors who have, they make money from one product and they offer the community product. Why would they give away the community product? Well, because they want to have a larger user base. That's a good reason. Okay, if I go out and I download Sugar CRM's Community Edition and I use it for a while and I'm happy with it, and now I'm going to need it for my new business or I'm going to need it for some critical reason, I'm likely to get the Pro Edition. Or perhaps I'm likely to pay for support for the Community Edition, which Sugar CRM also makes an option. So they're going to make money, but I'm going to start by testing it out for as long as I want to. It's none of this 30-day trial and the thing goes away. I can use it as long as I want. And if I'm a developer building a new product, that's really great for me, because it means I don't have to pay for a license until I'm going to put it into commercial use when money is coming in, hopefully. Next slide. All right. Another way that's sort of related to what we were talking about before is the support and training model. So I may not have anything to do with building the software, but I may be a very knowledgeable user of it. So I can teach you how to use LibreOffice. I can do that as a one-on-one class. I can do it in an official educational setting. I can do it in a company. I can offer my own professional courses. There are lots of ways that I can do it. And so, for a modest sum of money, or maybe for a lot of money, I'll do that training, and people will then maybe call on me to do some more training or some consulting or something. Also, the people who publish books and e-books, O'Reilly is a great example of that. O'Reilly has this huge business around open source. The open source conference is one of the best. And you have all of their publications. I'm sure every one of you as developers in this room have acquired and used one or more O'Reilly books. So they have a very successful business supporting open source software. Go ahead. Next slide. Another way that business involves open source, we were talking about a little bit in the van coming over here this morning, but it's broader than that. And it is the idea that I'm a system integrator. So I'm going to build a piece of software or a system for some client of mine, and I'm going to include open source software in it. Now, I have to be careful, as Phil just told you, about complying with the appropriate licenses and making sure that any open source software that I include is licensed properly and compatible with the product and compatible with my business goals. The way that I do that is by building my product and including the library. And now, as a consultant or a system integrator, where I make my money is from labor, right? It's billing out my developers at some extreme rate that lets me make money. I'm not going to make much money on the software. Even if it's a piece of commercial software, the vendor might give me a 10 or 15% discount to resell it, but I'm going to make money on the labor. So if I'm happy with some piece of open source software, then fine. I'll use that rather than have to enter into some complicated thing with a vendor. So IBM Global Services, Accenture, Gartner, you think of as doing this, but there's a whole lot more. In every country, you'll find that there are system integrators who work on government software. Right, and they do work for government agencies, and they understand how the government acquires software. And you find this almost everywhere. There's less of it in Brazil, where Brazil's government policy is to build public software that the various states and municipalities can use so that they don't have to spend money on consulting and they don't have to send money to foreign countries. It's a very enlightened and interesting policy. But in most of the world, you have particularly the Indian system integrators, Wipro and Tata Consultancy and Satyam and a few of the others that do this work on an outsourced basis and deliver products. So they make money, again, from their labor, not from the software itself. Go ahead. The dual license model goes back a long way, and MySQL in 1994 was one of the first, perhaps the first, to do this kind of dual licensing. What they said basically was, hey, download the software, use it, enjoy it, have fun. But if you put it in a commercial product that you're going to sell to other people, then the GPL license that we use for the free version doesn't work. You have to pay for a commercial license. So, same software, no changes, but 2 licenses. Again, this works out okay for small businesses because if I'm doing my development, I don't have to pay any money. I can use it. I'm not distributing the software, so I'm not in violation of any open source license. But when the day comes that I'm going to ship it to customers, then I need to have a commercial license for it. Same software, I don't have to change anything that I've done, but I do have to pay for the license. Okay, and so MySQL made money not only from support services and training, but also from commercial licenses for companies that were doing dual licensing. Go ahead. Hosted services. So we know that there are more and more of these hosted services. And there's good news and bad news here. Many of these companies, Google, Yahoo, Salesforce.com, make extensive use of open source software to build their products and services. But because they don't distribute that software, there's no requirement that they're free to use it, right? There's no distribution issue. They're free to use it, they're free to modify it. They're free to inspect, and all the freedoms that come with an open source software license. And as I noted earlier, more and more businesses are making their money that way. It's a long list. Let's go to the next slide. Advertising. So you can have open source software that you use maybe in a hosted service, or maybe it's downloadable. A great example is Firefox. I know a lot of people use Firefox, and the Mozilla Foundation last year made about $120 million on Firefox. And do you know where they made the money? In that little Google search box in the upper right. Because because Google pays the Mozilla Foundation money to be the default search engine. Because when you type something in there in Google and it shows you the page, then Google can display some advertising to you and perhaps monetize that if you click on one of the advertisers. So here's this wonderful piece of open source software, the Firefox browser, and their way to make money is through the advertising connection. Let's go ahead. Yet another way to make money. Did you know there were this many ways to make money from open source software? If you have a Berkeley license, for example, or any permissive license, the Berkeley license is interesting because it allows you to take a piece of open source software and include it in a closed product. So the open source Postgres relational database comes with a Berkeley license. It was developed by the same group that developed Ingress originally, which again is now open source. So a couple of companies came along and enhanced the Postgres version and went into business licensing the closed product. So Enterprise DB and SRA, a Japanese company, has an open source systems division where they support clustering of databases. So that's another example. Let's go ahead. You can see I've been out taking pictures of Malta. So another way to make money on open source software is to include it in some box where you're not selling the software, you're selling the box. So many of you may have Linksys routers. So Linksys had open source software in the routers, and when they were an independent company, then they got acquired by Cisco. And it turned out that they were not in compliance. They were not publishing the source code to the router software. Even though they were using open source software, when I buy my box, do I want to change my Wi-Fi router? Perhaps not, but I want the right to be able to do so. And since there was an open source license attached to that software, they had to publish it. The same issue is arising now with Android. Okay, so many of the vendors of Android devices are shipping open source software and not providing an appropriate link. They're not complying with the license. And this includes a lot of companies. And we won't mention them all because some of them are represented in this room. But there are a lot of compliance issues around Android. But the whole point is that you can build a system, sell the system, and then the open source software that drives it comes for free. Let's go on. We're getting close to the end, but we're not there yet. So the patronage model is interesting. It says, I'm going to contribute to the open source community. So Google sponsors Summer of Code. IBM supports the Eclipse project. Sun, for many years, supported open office development. And on and on and on, where they gave away money or paid people to support and enhance these projects. First of all, because they wanted to be able to use them themselves, but also because it was good publicity for them. And lastly, it was a good way to find talent. So if you have an open source project and you've got all your IBM employees working on the project and some other volunteers come along, you can tell pretty quickly if they're capable of doing good work and whether they have a personality that fits into your organization. And so when the time comes to hire new people, these contributors are proven talents. It's much better than an interview. You can see the kind of work they do. You can see how they participate and collaborate in a team. All kinds of things happen there. So people who are out of work, developers, often find that it's useful to participate in some successful open source project and make valuable contributions because it's a way to improve their own reputation and to make connections with people who work in companies where they might get hired, either as a contractor or as an employee. Let's go ahead. Packaging. So basically this says you take 2 or 3 or 4 or more open source products and you put them together and create a stack. And that stack can be deployed in the cloud. So one company that does this is Bitnami, and it's part of BitRock. So that's you can go there and you can get a pre-built stack for, say, Sugar CRM or any of 20 some odd other open source applications, and you download the appropriate version for your platform, Windows or Mac or Linux or something, and you get the database and PHP and whatever you need to be able to just do it. And they have built an installer that installs everything and gets you up and running. And Bitnami didn't have a business model for a long time, but now they have a business model which allows you to take that stack and deploy it in the cloud. So they have a business arrangement with Amazon Web Services, so you can have a Bitnami built stack deployed in the cloud. Again, you can be up and running in an hour, and they'll make money from that. They'll charge you for that. So that's their latest way to do that. There's a human resources system called Orange HRM developed in Sri Lanka that is similar. You can download the Orange HRM stack. And if you're doing a startup and you need a human resources management application, that's a pretty good one. Let's go ahead. Another way to make money is tchotchkes. T-shirts, mugs, decals. Open source developers, when you look at their laptops, they're very often covered with stickers. And of course, open source developers really don't wear much beyond T-shirts if they live in a climate that supports that. And so when I was at the FISLA conference in Brazil in June, the busiest booth was the one that was selling mugs and T-shirts and decals. And, they weren't in the open source business at all. But they were, it's like if you go to a rock concert, right? There's a certain, you pay money for the ticket, but then they charge like $40 for a T-shirt. That's a very profitable business. I know what it costs to make a T-shirt. So that's an open source business. All right, so let's go. Yes, time to go. Now, the reason I picked the old bus is not just that it used to be here, but that the founder of Canonical, the founder of Ubuntu Linux, is Mark Shuttleworth. And he now lives on the Isle of Man. And he bought one of these. And he had one shipped to the Isle of Man. So there is an open source connection between the Ubuntu project, the founder of the Ubuntu project, and the old Maltese buses. One more slide. All right, so this finds me, at least in a couple of ways. And my new best friend behind me there, so this turns out also to be an open source story. When I went to visit the people who built Orange HRM in Colombo, Sri Lanka, the head of the company has a tea plantation up in the hills. So his weekday job is to run this software company. His weekend job is to oversee his tea plantation. And so as his guest, we drove for hours up into beyond Kandy, Sri Lanka, which you can go look for on the map. But on the way is the Pinnawala Elephant Reserve. And this is where orphaned elephants and elephants with health problems and the like are brought to be nursed back to good health. And so my friend, the CEO of this company, took a picture of me with this elephant. So there we go. Thank you very much.
Tony, thank you very much. It reminds me about a statement made by a very good friend of mine and unfortunately my late mentor, Dr. Harlan D. Mills. He said, very good ideas are very seldom very complicated. And I think this was a list of good business ideas. I think that many of the people we struggle with in the marine community today have a tendency to make life very complicated for them because they spend a lot of time and a lot of money of developing things that has already been developed. They provide poor quality and they end up having customers being charged an arm and a leg, and the customers are very angry with them. So why would you like to do that? Wouldn't it be better to take one of or many of Tony's ideas and make some good business and make life much more easy for us? That's basically what we're trying to do with Marsa. Thank you very much. Thank you.